Ladies and gentlemen, good morning once again. It is very unlikely that the military history of the only nation that has won a counter-insurgency campaign in the 21st century would be complete without the story of its elite forces. The Special Operations Community is represented by the finest fighting outfit of the Sri Lanka Army, organized into two regiments, namely the Commandos and Special Forces. Now, these Special Operations Forces, operating from the sharp end of the strategy through to the operational level and at times tactical level, executing a multitude of missions, spearheaded the campaign. Striking at the terrorist leadership in the depth of the LTT controlled areas, destroying and disrupting their indirect power weapon systems in the mid-battle space and also their reserves, and at times counterattacking to restore the critical defenses. These elites made a seamless contribution to the overall success of this campaign, which is unparalleled in the history of counterinsurgency. Ladies and gentlemen, in the next 25 minutes or so, I'll be taking you through the experience of Special Operations Forces or the elite forces of Sri Lanka Army, and that will include a glance at the history of these elite forces, insights into employment in different phases of the campaign, evaluation of overall impact on the operation by the Special Forces and Commandos, and finally, the lessons learned. And to give you a little introduction to these elites of the Sri Lanka Army, the Commandos were raised in 1980 as a direct action and counter-terror force, whereas the Special Forces were raised 5 years later, in 1985, to conduct unconventional warfare and operations in rural, remote, and urban environments. However, due to the nature of the conflict and their employment over the years, both forces became highly effective and versatile in the conduct of counter-guerrilla and counter-insurgent warfare that are waged in jungle, rural, and urban environments. Their skills were diversified over the years, and their capabilities in long-range patrolling, anti-hijack and hostage rescue operations, waterborne and heliborne operations, combat riding, sniping, and demolitions were acquired, developed, mastered, and finally applied successfully in combat. Explaining next in an outline is the operational and employment concepts of these elite forces during their battles in the northern and eastern theaters of operations separately. Now, it is significant to note that in the east, a complete different operational strategy was adopted by the army as against its strategy in the north. The elite forces were employed to spearhead the thrusts of infantry units directed towards the LTT. The factors that influenced in deciding such a concept were the dispersed enemy dispositions and the thick forest with overhead canopy that is commonly found in the east. And the operations are so designed to fight in the LTT with elite forces spanning out in small teams ahead of infantry battalions, gathering information and eroding LTT combat power through a series of well-coordinated attacks over an extended period, thus pulling the battalions to the decisive points on the battlefield. And this process was repeated in stages. By applying this design, the military operations in the Eastern Theater were conducted in two phases. And in the previous session, all manuals how it was done were amply explained by Brigadier General Galagi. During the operation in the Eastern Theater, it was spaced out to conduct operation in two phases. And in the phase one, Special Forces supported by some infantry units captured the northern part of the theater, whereas in the second phase, Commandos supported by some infantry units captured the remaining part of the LTT part of the theater. When the humanitarian operations were extended to the north, the elite forces were employed to operate across the entire width and depth of the 1E operational theatre. The 1E operation is usually called the Northern Operational Theatre. And the tasks of these elite forces range from long-range patrols to small group operations behind enemy lines, conventional operations to unconventional operations, and rescue operations to strike operations. Long-range patrols conducted strategically important operations deeply into the enemy-held territory, such as gaining targets for airstrikes and artillery, ambushing LTT movements, particularly their leaders, and threatening their lines of communication. Meanwhile, the other elite forces operated up to about 20 kilometers ahead of the fighting infantry brigades and divisions, mainly in support of close operations. Thus, these elite forces considerably denied the freedom of movement to the LTT in their rear. It could be safely said that the advantages gained in the battlefield by successful operations of elite forces were well exploited by the infantry. Let me now explain to you with some examples as to how the ways and means of employment of elite forces in gaining operational and tactical level advantages. While infantry formations closely engaged with the LTTE, the elite forces infiltrated through the LTT positions to their rear in small teams and carried out concentrated attacks, causing a severe damage to them. Now this forced the LTT to thin out their cadres who had been engaged with the advancing infantry and making their defeat inevitable. Now the elite forces have proved their capability of destroying a considerable number of LTT cadres in a given area prior to infantry reaching their objectives. It is also significant that towards the very end of the battle, the elite forces, having been employed to mop up the area, they resorted to precision targeting and managed to kill almost all the remaining LTT leadership. Protection of flanks of the infantry divisions was one of the main tasks that had been entrusted to the elite forces. As infantry formations advanced forward, their flanks were extended because they liberated areas. Elite forces operated away from these flanks and denied LTT cadres posing a major threat to these flanks. A classic example for this is that when the 5-7 division was leaning on Kilinochchi and the Task Force 2 defenses had stretched to its limits, the army had a somewhat peculiar defense configuration with over 50-kilometer open flank, which was very vulnerable. The effective domination of this flank by the elite forces ensured that both divisions were able to capture their objectives without much interference from their flanks. There were a number of instances where elite forces repulsed LTT counterattack and prevented LTT regaining initiative. In one such instance, just after 572 Brigade captured Company's stronghold and resumed advance, LTT launched a major counter-attack and pushed the brigade about 2 kilometers south and threatened to penetrate even further, ensuing fierce fighting in the area. Immediately, 2 squadrons of special forces were rushed to the area, who repulsed LTT attack and regained the control after 2 days of fierce fighting. In another instance, during late January 2009, when the army was poised to encircle the rest of the LTT controlled areas, with 7 divisions fighting their way through, forces estimated that LTT would concentrate its force at one point on the defenses of the army and attempt to break into the jungles in order to escape to the south. Now, to counter this probability, the elite forces were strategically positioned behind infantry frontages. Now, this contingency paid off 3 times in later stages, as LTT launched 3 fierce counteroffensives to break into the jungles. The fiercest of all 3 was the LTT counteroffensive south of Pudukirappu, where, after 593 Brigade had been completely defeated and pushed back about 5 kilometers by the LTT, the special forces were launched into the area along with commandos to hold the LTT thrust, and they fought back gallantly and regained the control. There were some situations where the progress of infantry advance was impeded or literally halted by well-fortified LTT strong points. So as a last resort, elite forces were called to overcome these strong points. And one such instance, in west of Tampane, 572 Brigade struggled to overcome the LTT strong point that fell along its axis. Special forces raided this strong point, killing a number of terrorists and capturing the area, after which the brigade progressed unimpeded. On 29th September 2008, the LTT raided one of the Air Force bases in the rear of the theater, using the elites, the Black Tigers. Two LTT aircraft bombed the base at the same time.